Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Carlos Uxo, and on behalf of the Monash Crime Fiction Project, I welcome everybody to our presentation today. Before I introduce the speakers, I want to acknowledge that I'm talking from the Bunurong lands of the Kulin Nation, and I'm acknowledging, paying my respect to the traditional elders, past, present, and emerging. Today we have with us Ellie Gardner and Fiona Wade, who will be talking about trends of tropes, representations of domestic violence in Australian crime fiction. So you can take it from now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carlos, and thank you for inviting us to present at this seminar series. We presented a version of this paper, as some of you will know, at the recent Captivating Criminality Conference held in Melbourne this year, which was fantastic. So it was lovely to be invited back to Monash to speak today on a topic that Fiona and I care about deeply, and it's a topic that's happily brought us back as researchers into the crime fiction space. I want to also acknowledge that we're zooming today from the beautiful Wiradjuri land in Albury and Ngunnawal country in Canberra, and pay our respects to elders past and present. And I also want to extend that respect to all First Nations people who are here today. So we started thinking about this project 12 months ago, and when we began our preliminary discussions about it, we realised that the familiar novels that came to mind featuring domestic violence as a central theme or main storyline existed outside the crime fiction space. We see it featured as the main narrative thread in a number of general fiction, YA, and even romance novels, including Tony Birch's Women and Children, Loveland by Robert Lukens, The Gulf by Anna Spargo Ryan, Boy Swallows Universe by Trent Dalton, of course, and Big Little Lies, which sits adjacent to crime fiction. We also see it in popular novels like Where the Crawdads Sing and the recently controversial It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. And of course, Hollywood will deal with this theme quite intensely in films like Sleeping with the Enemy, The Invisible Man, and Gaslight, which all highlight domestic violence as something to specifically interrogate and emphasize or bring into the light. But we wanted to know what this looked like in crime fiction, and specifically in Australian crime fiction, considering the genre's history of representing women in equally subversive and damaging ways. Jill Plain argues that thinking about gender in relation to crime fiction is not simply a matter of representation. It is also the case that the genre itself has long been considered gendered, with its subgenres like the hard-boiled narrative, for example, and its early binary definitions of women as either virgin or whore. Contemporary crime fiction narratives are generally less prescriptive and conservative and continue both reinforcing and disrupting genre conventions in what is described by Jesper Gouldall and Stuart King as a tension between conventionality and innovation. Crime fiction has, of course, always responded to the real world, and it reflects our biggest problems as a society back at us. And as such, violence against women has always existed in the genre. Peter Messent notes that the genre more often than not focuses on harm done to the human body and especially the female body, a focus that in many traditional crime fiction texts relegates women to the margins as faceless, nameless corpses. We wanted to know how recent crime fiction treated DV in light of this history of the genre and in light of its previous and ongoing engagements with gender violence. So today we want to present the findings of our research, which focused on 13 Australian crime fiction novels published between 2014 and 2024 that feature DV as either a main narrative or notable subplot. And we argue that they contribute uniquely to the cultural discussion surrounding this kind of violence, and that they do this in complex and sometimes paradoxical ways. So that you can see, obviously, the list of titles here. We've included Big Little Lies and Hush Little Bird under the term crime fiction, as they're often referred to in the context of psychological thriller or suspense novel. So we conducted an initial survey using AusLit of Australian novels published within our timeframe, which had keywords related to domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and family violence. We also found some titles through our reading and research related to DV and crime fiction, but many were out of the date range and were also internationally published. Ultimately, we made a short list of novels from commercial and independent publishers, as well as those that were self-published, but we manually narrowed it down to around 20 and then finally 13. We were looking for patterns, commonalities and differences, and we were wanting to think about how these books engaged with real-life crime trends and or whether they perpetuated damaging stereotypes related to DV and gender violence. Our analysis of these novels reveals alignments with current domestic violence trends and attitudes in Australia, particularly in relation to the image of the perpetrator and descriptions of coercive control. For example, the abusers in these novels are almost always white, educated, and generally well respected in their communities, which rejects, to use Diane Shu's words, popular characterizations of perpetrators as primarily alcoholic or drug addicted, psychotic, or non-white and lower class. Representations of coercive control in the novels are nuanced and reflective of DV realities, where abusers use techniques like gaslighting, surveillance, and isolation to strip the victim of their identity. Many of the authors engaged with real-life cases of domestic or family violence to write their novels, such as Jane Caro, who consulted the judgment transcript of Simon Gattani to write The Mother. Deborah Oswald, the author of The Family Doctor, also mirrors the Gattani case in her novel, as well as the murder of Jack and Jennifer Edwards in Sydney in 2018. The perpetrator in Woman Missing shares striking similarities to Christopher Lee Watts in the US, who murdered his wife and children. And the characterization of Simon in Hush Little Bird echoes recently convicted Australian children entertainers Rick Marshall, Robert Hughes, and Rolf Harris. On the whole, the novels generally treat this theme with care and nuance, with some exceptions, of course, and they emphasise domestic violence as a serious crime in urgent need of attention in Australia. But the novels also further some troubling tropes, which at times results in problematic or limited perceptions of domestic violence realities. For example, while Jess Hill writes in See What You Made Me Do that not one researcher has been able to find a victim type in cases of domestic violence in Australia, our novels suggest that there is in fact a perfect victim or victim type. She is white, middle to upper class, and she's heteronormative, at least as she is represented in the mainstream commercial literature. Despite crime trends suggesting that First Nations women and women of colour are 8 times more likely to experience DV, none of these commercially published novels explored indigeneity at all or spoke to this reality. There was also a notable lack of characters and experiences from other marginalised groups, including LGBTQIA+ communities and people with disabilities, despite DV occurring in high numbers within these groups. We know that literature is not always a perfect mirror to society, but this erasure of difference seems an attempt to sort of universalise the experience of DV and to think about it in very normative terms for sort of easy consumption. The novels also emphasise the untrustworthiness or corruption of police, courts, and investigative bodies, and suggest instead that the solutions to DV rest almost exclusively with the individual. In her book, Domestic Violence in Hollywood Film, Shoes, who I mentioned before, writes that overwhelmingly her chosen films propose that abused women can and must single-handedly solve their problem. But in our novels, this burden falls primarily to an external figure, almost always a woman, who is either personally or professionally linked to the case. She's either a mother, friend, a doctor, or an investigating agent. This aligns with another of Jill Plain's observations that detectives now are mothers, fathers, daughters, lovers, implicated in the social fabric of their investigations and frequently motivated by the personal. The subsequent rise in vigilante anti-heroine type figures in these novels reflects this shift, particularly in the context of Me Too and fourth wave feminism, but also furthers beliefs that domestic violence is a woman's problem and that it belongs in the private and therefore sort of unknowable sphere. We follow Shu's lead in identifying our novels as existing in a context of what she calls post-awareness, the somewhat naive conviction, quote, that we have progressed beyond our past denial, that we are now not only savvy about, but roundly condemn this form of violence and its perpetrators, and that we are sympathetic to and supportive of abused women. The mystery at the core of our novels is not about who committed the crime, but how the victim can survive both the ongoing crimes of domestic violence and the perpetrator. Shoes defines this post-awareness context as resting on the misguided belief that if we haven't solved domestic violence, we have, quote, nonetheless given it our best efforts, thereby absolving us of further responsibility and eliminating the need to address the problem of the socio-cultural frameworks and institutions, including ongoing sexism and patriarchal privilege, that continue to make male partner abuse possible. Our novels do address the failings at institutional levels and within governmental bodies in the novels, which often leads the characters to the realization that the only way out is to sort of take matters into their own hands. But while nearly all the novels condemn the failings of police and the courts, for example, and present challenges to everyday misogyny experienced by the characters, they offer few solutions to domestic violence outside the extreme, unrealistic option of vigilante violence. We see this in Big Little Lies, The Mother, The Family Doctor, Daughters of Eve, Hush Little Bird, and Traced. What they do emphasise, though, is that writing about DV is complex, it's contradictory, and that crime fiction can be a powerful vehicle through which attitudes, trends, and beliefs about DV can be interrogated.
Despite the criminality of DV across all jurisdictions of Australia, intimate family violence continues to be a scourge in our communities and appears not to be abating. In Australia, 1 in 3 women has experienced physical violence since the age of 15, and 1 in 5 has experienced sexual violence. On average, a woman is killed by an intimate partner every 10 days and is more likely to experience violence at particular life stages, such as while pregnant or while separating from a relationship. High-profile cases of domestic violence in Australia, such as the deaths of Hannah Clark and her children in Queensland, have highlighted the urgency of what the Rapid Review expert panel suggests is not a national crisis, but a national emergency. Jess Hill says that domestic abuse cuts a deep wound into our society. But it's of interest to note that currently there is no single term nationally accepted, nor is there an agreed definition of what actual domestic violence is and means. While Jess Hill and crime fiction academic Sue Turnbull use the term domestic abuse in their writings, the federal government's National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children, 2022 to 2032, refers to domestic and family sexual violence and points to finding consistent terminology as one of their first recommendations. However, for this purposes of our study, we have settled on the term domestic violence, or DV. So while terminology may change, it can be said the definitions are all similar in interpretation. Services Australia reports that any behaviour that's violent, threatening, controlling, or intended to make you or your family feel scared and unsafe can be considered family or domestic violence. The New South Wales government website defines it as any behaviour in an intimate or family relationship which is violent, threatening, coercive, or controlling, causing a person to live in fear. But this operates under the assumption that victim survivors are aware of the abuse, which is not always the case, particularly in coercive control situations. This is picked up in some of the novels. Nicole Tropes' protagonist in Hush Little Bird, for example, can only reflect later in life that her husband, who she married at 15 to his 31, was emotionally and financially abusive, as well as a serial rapist and abuser, really not very good at all. This is similar to Catherine Jink's protagonist, Meg, in her novel Shelter, which came out in 2021, who is made aware of the coercive relationship by her mother-in-law. When discussing domestic and family violence, it is important to understand who comes under the Crimes Act. While it appears obvious, family relationships are not only between family members, such as partners or previous partners, parents, siblings, and other family members or kinship relationships. These crimes can also occur in relationships involving carers of people with a disability or medical condition or elders. The prevalence of these crimes is horrendous. In New South Wales, police officers respond to nearly 500 DV incidents every day. while the New South Wales Police Force estimate that DV accounts for up to 40% of police work. This, of course, does not include the number of unreported cases due to several factors, including fear of not being believed, shame, fear of retaliation, cultural issues, minimising the severity of the abuse, or a lack of awareness of support services. As Jess Hill writes, we talk a lot about the danger of dark alleys, but the truth is that in every country around the world, the home is the most dangerous place for a woman. And this informs subgenres of crime fiction such as domestic noir. And here we see the juxtaposition between reality and fiction, and must ask, if Australian crime novelists are replicating what is occurring in society today, why is domestic violence not the main plotline in more commercial crime fiction novels? It's imperative to note that instances of domestic violence are not only perpetrated, nor are they specifically crimes against women, although they are overrepresented in the statistics, as are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, women living with a disability, LGBTQIA+ individuals, and people from migrant communities. Despite this reality, media reports of DV in Australia continue to prioritise the stories of white, heterosexual, non-disabled, female victims, and often frame the perpetrator using apologistic or passive language. We've spoken about the lack of diversity in our novels, but what this results in is a problematic framing of DV experiences as universal in nature, as we've already said. This aligns with Shu's suggestion that post-aware attitudes towards abuse are still characterised by the dichotomous thinking that associates domestic violence with either alterity or sameness. This results in colour and class-blind scenarios of victimhood and empowerment with ostensibly broader appeal. The silence of the realities of DV in marginal communities is seen in Gabriel Lord's Dishonour as the only exception to this within the group of novels that we looked at, highlights a troubling chasm in Australian crime fiction's response to DV that reflects more broadly on the country's attitudes to DV, including masculinity and femininity, and the experience of those considered different. To return to the fiction, our novels feature elements of domestic noir, some more than others, particularly Big Little Lies, but we hesitate to strictly define them as such due to their hybridity. For example, the novels take elements from other subgenres, including the police procedural, suspense or thriller, bush noir, and transgressional, I've been talking all day, fiction, narratives which centralise anti-heroic vigilantes or rogue protagonists operating outside the traditional systems. To return to domestic noir, which is probably the most closely related genre to our novels, Julia Crouch, who coined the term in 2013, writes that, in a nutshell, domestic noir takes place primarily in homes and workplaces, concerns itself largely, but not exclusively, with the female experience, is based around relationships, and takes as its base a broadly feminist view that the domestic sphere is a challenging and sometimes dangerous prospect for its inhabitants. Early examples are, of course, Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl, Paula Hawkins' Girl on the Train, and A.G. Finn's Woman in the Window, and these novels centralise female subjectivity and feature flawed protagonists seeking the truth, often about themselves, others, their relationships or past, or a crime they've witnessed. As Deborah Phillips argues, these novels can be read as expressions of profound mistrust in a contemporary form of masculinity. The suspense in these novels, or the narrative tension, derives, as Phillips says, from the mounting recognition that a male partner may not be trustworthy, shock horror, however attentive and loving they may initially appear. As noted earlier, the tension in our novel is not predicated on the question of whether domestic violence is occurring, but on how to solve, escape, or avenge it. Despite Shu's justified critique of post-awareness as an excuse for willful ignorance, this suggests an increased awareness of DV realities in Australia and increasing empathy for the plight of victim survivors. There is little scholarship on the representation of domestic violence, particularly in Australian crime fiction, commercial crime fiction. Sue Turnbull examines domestic abuse in The Dry and notes that the story focuses primarily on the trials and tribulations of negotiating complex gender relationships in a close-knit small-town community and, as it emerges, the horror of domestic abuse and incest. Significantly, Turnbull notes that the protagonist, Aaron Falk, is unable to solve the problem of male violence, nor can he solve the problem of climate change that is devastating the town. His quest for knowledge and understanding, therefore, has its limitations. Falk exposes the truth of the Hadler family murders and Ellie's death at the hand of her abusive father, but is helpless in Ellie's case to change the outcome, seek retributive justice, or alter the socio-cultural frameworks and attitudes that allow and foster abuse. Similarly, our novels seem to position vigilantism as the only viable solution to DV, and these vigilantes are mostly always women who occupy roles commonly associated with nurturing and caregiving, their mothers, doctors, wives. Roberta Garrett suggests that bringing gender violence into the public face of feminist activism has helped raise awareness, but many of our novels, including The Dry, continue to filter domestic violence through the perspectives of investigative outsiders to the crime, or by using narrative devices such as flashbacks, suggesting that we still can't truly face domestic violence. A key feature of domestic noir is the abused female protagonist's unreliable narration, which is a cleverer structural commentary on gaslighting, for no one knows what to believe, but our novels rarely present the victim survivor's POV or narration. The exceptions to this are Big Little Lies, The Caretaker, and Hush Little Bird, but it's only in Big Little Lies and Catherine Jinks's novels Traced and Shelter that domestic violence happens on the page in real time.
So in her discussion of domestic noir and gendered violence, Meg Vann says that a prevailing feature is the absence of direct dramatisation of domestic violence. Instead, it's generally implied or reported by an unreliable narrator. While this shifts the focus away from the spectacle of the battered female body, it places the onus on the fictional victim to sort of prove the truth of their experiences, which reflects problematic victim-blaming attitudes that question women's truthfulness. To bring this into the real world for a moment, the results of a 2021 ANROS report into community attitudes towards DV found that 34% of respondents believed it was common for sexual assault allegations to be used as a way to get back at men, and 1 in 4 respondents believed women who don't leave their abusive partners are partly responsible for the abuse continuing. Another attitude prevalent in the report was that allegations of DV were often exaggerated to gain tactical advantage in a case. So the effect of the narrative distance in these novels, both from the victim's point of view and distance from actual instances of abuse, is twofold. On the one hand, it rejects sensationalizing and romanticizing DV, as Big Little Lies has been accused of, and therefore it challenges crime fiction's historical focus on the victimized female body, but it also situates DV as a private, tabooed individual problem. The assumptions that come with making DV such a private thing is that, it's shameful, that victims won't be believed, and that it's the victim's fault. But none of our novels actually suggest this, which I think is really important. Instead, they seek to push the boundaries of these stereotypes and limitations despite their occasional reinforcement of them, and they often outwardly reject the structures and systems that fail women in violent relationships. Domestic violence fiction often features an investigating agent, which Stephen Knight argues is a quintessential trope of modern crime fiction more broadly, but which we argue in this context presents a rejection of traditional investigative and punitive forces. This aligns with Australian crime fiction's history as anti-authoritarian, but also reflects a deeper belief that the systems and structures meant to protect women in Australia repeatedly fail them. The extreme solution of vigilantism in the texts, no matter how morally ambiguous or corrupt, reflects both a shift in feminist fiction trends and the very real feeling of destitution or futility in real life responses to DV. So we now just want to turn in the final part of the presentation to some of the novels and to discuss a couple of standout ones, plus some general thoughts on the selection as a whole. So one of the first novels on our list was Jane Caro's The Mother, published in 2022, which follows protagonist Miriam, who is grieving the loss of her husband. Miriam slowly starts to realise that her daughter Ali is in an abusive relationship with her husband Nick, who is a well-respected vet or pillar of society kind of figure, as Jane Gilmore writes in reference to the portrayals of abusive men in the media. I said before that our novels generally don't speculate on whether abuse is occurring and that they're more about how to get out of the situation or solve it. But this one does show Miriam go through the process of realising what's going on. She watches Nick strip Ali of her independence, isolate her, put up security cameras to constantly watch her, and she very quickly finds out as well about his violent physical abuse and gaslighting. Ali leaves Nick, and for years after, he torments the family, threatening to kill her children, to kill her. He stalks and harasses them. I'm about to give a massive spoiler, so mute me if you want, but after realising there's no other option, Miriam murders Nick in broad daylight by shooting him on a busy city street. She's jailed for 15 years, but serves 7, and it's positioned as the price she's willing to pay for her daughter and grandchildren's safety. Nick is described initially by Miriam as warm and easygoing, and he's a vet, you know, what's not to like. And similarly, in Michael Robotham Close Your Eyes, the murderer, Francis Washburn, is described as someone who comes across as the only sane member of the family, happily married with a new baby. Why would he kill his niece and sister-in-law? These images of the perpetrator as an overall good guy from the outside reflect reality. Of course, we know that women are almost always killed by someone they know, and that these men are not hiding in dark alleys, as Hill speaks of. Close Your Eyes uses the problematic stereotype of the abuser as a junkie or a peeping Tom kind of character as a red herring. And in The Dry, domestic violence is used also as a red herring in the Hadler family murder case, which opens the book. We learn that Luke was not a downtrodden, depressed farmer who killed his family and himself because of the drought, but that someone else was responsible. Of course, we get the DV plotline through the flashbacks of Ellie and what happened to her. So generally, the novels identify the threat of the home and the facade of the top bloke as serious realities in domestic violence cases, and very rarely, if at all, fall into perpetuating outdated stereotypes of villains as other. The mother also expresses a deep loss of faith in the police, which causes Miriam to kill Nick. She narrates that eventually they had stopped going to the police. It wasn't that the cops weren't sympathetic, it was just that they couldn't do anything. She goes so far as to say that the justice system, which she'd believed in all her life, not only didn't help, but it made everything worse. This distrust of the police is present in many of the novels: Woman Missing, The Caretaker, Daughters of Eve, The Family Doctor, Hush Little Bird, and Traced and Shelter, which leads to either vigilantism or resorting to private investigators or other non-police bodies. Domestic violence theorist Evan Stark speaks about women who enact violence to escape their situation, writing that women's right to use whatever means are available to liberate themselves from coercive control derives from the mode men use to oppress them, not from the proximate physical or psychological harms they may suffer because of abuse. At the level of fiction, revenge narratives are useful role reversals that allow for a sort of wish fulfillment, particularly in the good for her subgenre that's emerging in film and literature at the moment. Our novels, though, aren't so much girl power post-feminist revenge narratives, but are instead extreme explorations of very real realities where there are limited options. This sentiment about the police is shared in Woman Missing by Cheryl Clarke, which follows Louisa Alcott, who's an ex-cop who begins working as a private investigator on 2 separate domestic violence cases. Lou's new agency is described in definite terms as not the police. Client confidentiality is paramount, and sometimes we do go the extra mile for people, even if it means we cross the line, very dramatic. The normal processes are described as slow and bogged down with red tape, which forces Lou to transgress the boundaries of her role in a similar way to Miriam, but definitely not as drastic. For instance, she follows the husband of a recently missing woman and finds him burying her body, and it's her brazen investigative tactics that nearly get her killed at the end of the novel, which is pretty standard, I'd say, in crime fiction novels. We have that climactic, finale. But what's interesting as well about Woman Missing, The Caretaker, Under the Cold Bright Lights, and even The Dry to an extent, is that they initially position domestic violence as central to the plot, yet eventually pivot to focus on more sensational plot points related to serial killers, underworld gangs, and white-collar crime. In Woman Missing, the second domestic violence case Lou takes is actually not about DV in the end, and Melinda, the victim, ends up being murdered by a serial killer who kidnaps Lou and nearly kills her in her pursuit. Similarly, in The Caretaker, protagonist Charlotte is on the run after being blamed for killing her abusive partner. Another spoiler, it wasn't her, it was the mafia. And the main suspense in the novel is, again, her interactions with a man revealed to be a serial killer. So on the one hand, we have novels in our selection that centralise domestic violence and maintain that focus. And on the other, we have novels that use DV as a hook, as a red herring, or a stealth subplot in favour of a sort of bigger and better story.
In reading Deborah Oswald's 2021 The Family Doctor, the similarity of the novel's initial crime to the brutal 2018 killings of Jack and Jennifer Edwards by their estranged father in Sydney can't be overlooked. And later in the novel, there are definite synergies to the real-life crimes of convicted murderer Simon Gittany. This novel has multiple narratives of DV, and like others in the collection we have chosen, vigilanteism is seen as the only solution. This time, unlike in The Mother, the vigilante is someone who exists outside the family unit, spurred on by guilt of not being able to stop the death of her close friend and her friend's children. While Oswald makes it clear in the narrative that police involvement, including the issuing of AVOs and even a jail sentence, had failed to keep the family safe, the police are not demonised, but rather it's the system that's seen as fault. This is probably the only book in the collection that didn't make the police out as the baddies. As Oswald writes, everyone did all the right things and there was no reason to think she wasn't safe. Paula, the character in the book, a GP and best friend of the first victim and her children, acts to then rid the world of violent men, crossing the line between right and wrong. She becomes more and more unstable, more desperate. This potentially could be seen as her mirroring the behaviour of the murderous husband of her friend. She even says, Matt must have been mentally ill. This is instantly rejected by another friend, Anita, who says, and you have to excuse some of the language, was he? Was he? I guess he was. But what the fuck does that mean? He planned this. It wasn't some temporary brain snap. He planned this for fucking weeks. As the narrative draws to a close, Paula's behaviour escalates out of control and consequently Paula is incarcerated. While in jail, she redeems herself by working with inmates to improve their outcomes. In Gabrielle Lord's Dishonour, published in 2014 and probably the earliest of the ones that we looked at, it's the only novel in which includes a non-Anglo victims and a serving police officer as the investigator. Detective Inspector Deborah Hawkins, the character, is suspended from duty, however, once again indicating that solutions are to be found outside the justice system. Hawkins, appointed the head of a new police unit targeting violence against women, hits a wall of silence, and she says, "The unit I've been so proud of heading seemed doomed for demolition." And it's not until Hawkins is suspended from duty that she gets resolution to the DV crime. The novel illustrates the difficulty police find in applying Western justice to immigrant cultures, particularly those that are systematically patriarchal. Author Catherine Jinks has put domestic and family violence at front and centre of her 2021 and 2023 novels, Shelter and Traced. In both of these, the solution to domestic violence is violence. In Shelter, Meg takes on the mother role to Noreen, who is escaping a violent ex-partner. In Traced, it is Jane, the mother, once again, who takes on the role of protector of her child, who was a victim, stereotyping the family roles. Jane, who was labelled as overprotective and delusional when she tried to intervene when her daughter was in an abusive relationship, feels duty-bound to protect the perpetrator's next victim when, as a COVID contact tracer, she stumbles across her daughter's ex-partner. In Shelter, Meg, a victim survivor herself, is part of a secret network of domestic abuse survivors scattered around the country. She takes in Noreen and her 2 young daughters, who were supposedly running away from an unfavourable ruling in the family court where she lost custody. Chilling words of inclusion are muttered. Noreen belongs to a club no one wants to be a member of. Meg says she's one of us. But during the narrative, the reader finds, in actual fact, it's the victim who is the perpetrator. This twist is a disturbing element in the subgenre, and it can be seen in recent work by UK writers Jane Casey and, interestingly, Julia Crouch. Perhaps authors are using this narrative sequence to address the Tropes framework, to include a red herring. After all, novels where domestic violence is central to the plot, there's a certain amount of predictability. So maybe I come back to my original question and say, maybe after all, we have to consider that DV is a premise that does not belong in commercially published crime fiction.
So in terms of where we are now, we're aiming to submit this paper for publication before the end of the year. There's a lot of potential for further research. For example, it would be interesting to investigate representations of marginalised communities and DV in crime fiction, and this might mean having to expand to television, maybe for a wider range. We also think expanding to the years before 2014, of course, would be worthwhile to think about, particularly how DV was figured in Australian crime fiction before the rise of domestic noir as a subgenre. We would like to think about, perhaps in a larger project, how other countries deal with DV in novels where it's a central plotline. And I'm also interested in whether there'll be a turn towards sort of dark humour or satire in future publications, similar to something like My Sister the Serial Killer, particularly because we're seeing this trend in contemporary fiction more broadly, and they're almost always to do with women seeking revenge on bad men. We're interested, finally, there's many things we're interested in, finally, in whether we'll move beyond vigilantism as a way out or a go-to. But, you know, maybe we're not quite done with the role reversal narratives just yet. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening and for the opportunity to present.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona and Ellie. Excellent. Well, it's definitely a lot of food for thought there. So I'll open now to if anybody has questions. I don't know if their hands up, but just people are clapping. But if you have a question, because since there are only 10 of us, just unmute yourself and we'll find out if you want to ask a question. Who wants to go first? Come on, don't be shy.
Okay, I'll go. I've got lots of thoughts. I'm not sure I actually have so many questions. I was thanks for the paper. I found it really fascinating. It's the second time I've heard it. The first time I was a bit more stressed because I was organizing the conference, so I didn't capture all the nuances of it, but I really enjoyed the paper today. I was interested in this idea of post-awareness, and it seems to resolve on this on it. There's a tension between the post-aware reader with the pre-aware protagonist, and doesn't that in some way add to that kind of predictability of the reading? In which case, is there is the crime genre perhaps, if I've got to ask a question around this, is the crime genre perhaps the vehicle for talking about domestic noir? If the tension that you get in traditional crime novels from trying to work out who's done it or who's responsible disappears.
Yeah, this is so interesting. I was talking to my partner about this, and she said, well, no one wants to read about it because it's just really, it's really depressing, and there's nothing to be solved. There's no mystery about it. We know what this looks like. And so, yeah, I think that's very true. And so I think the question of, whether it's might be too much of an exaggeration to say it's the vehicle through which we can examine DV. I think it's a good vehicle to examine gendered violence in general, but maybe this particular strand is not, it's not really work. It doesn't really work for the genre. So yeah, I think that the post-awareness stuff is really interesting. And yeah, you're right. The protagonists are sort of, as you say, pre-aware, and the reader's reading it going, oh yeah, well, we know what's going on. We know, we're trying to tell you. Maybe that's the only tension that's sort of there, where the reader's, frustratingly thinking, I know what's going on. I need you to realize that too. And especially in the mother, that's the case, because we know right from the start really what's going on. So yeah, I think that,
and
Fiona,
I think that's what, and that's certainly what, I've come to as I've been reading through these. I think that Jane Caro said quite interestingly when she spoke in Melbourne, that, maybe people writing about domestic violence in commercially published novels, it will alert people to what they're actually dealing with, and maybe then take action. Not vigilante action, one would hope, but then they would take action knowing how, moving forward and changing the situation. But I think that it's the way that I mean, and what certainly brought me to this idea in the first place was how crime writers want or say openly that they are the ones that investigate all these things that are socially happening, and they are social interrogators. Well, this is a social issue, and it's one of the most intense issues that and prevalent. So you would expect them to want to interrogate it, but I'm coming to the conclusion that to actually have it and then put it in a commercially published book, which is then marketed as something with DV, is maybe not, and crime is maybe not the right way. That's what I'm coming to the conclusion, because I just think that what they're then turning it into is, the books where the victim is actually the perpetrator. I think we're going to see more of these, and that's not what, as someone in, as a writer who is interrogating crime fiction and social issues, this is not what we want to necessarily see them do. And I hasten to add that the actual percentage of people who put in false reports through the courts is about 8%.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems like we had a sort of an era of, Gone Girl is sort of that. Sorry if I'm breaking up a bit. Gone Girl was sort of that, but now we're sort of, maybe I hope we're not really returning to that as a as a main focus.
Mm.
That's interesting because, sorry, Carlos, but that's interesting because the the post-awareness, it's because of the post-awareness that Gone Girl works as for the whole tension of it, the surprise. And it's interesting that when you mentioned, sorry, I'll let Carlos go on and I'll leave my questions for.
Oh, no. I just had a comment on the predictability that to some extent I think the predictability may be one of the attractions of crime fiction, because you know that at the end, and I think that is what happens in your 13 novels, the baddie pays for it one way or another. So to some extent it's predictable, but you get the result that we all want to see in the novel. I think it'll be interesting to see who reads these novels, and if it's mostly women or men. Women who want to see someone paying for in any shape or form for that, and if men mainly are just moving away from that, interested in other forms of crime fiction.
I don't know off the top of my head. my intuition would say that these are marketed and bought by women.
Mhm.
That's my intuition. I've got nothing to back that up, but that's what I would suggest.
I guess the closest thing is true crime, and we know that true crime is
Mm.
mostly read or listened to by women in a percentage much higher than male.
Yeah. Apparently in Victoria where they have mushrooms.
Yes, we share mushrooms sometimes. Any other questions from anyone else?
Yeah, I have a question. I just want to say, hey Fiona, how are you?
Hi, Carolyn, how are you?
Good. It's been forever.
I know.
Good. And lovely, Stuart, to meet you as well. Actually, like, have a face there. Yeah, I was just really interested in your comment, I think, Stuart, around the you know, does it fit within, does it suit the genre? I was thinking about you know, the subgenre of thriller where you have the cat and mouse, and that would kind of work quite well, I think, for a lot of the gaps in DV awareness. So in terms of when women leave, that is when they are most at risk. And so it's not so much about solving the mystery of who done it. It's more about, well, you know, is this person going to survive, and how will this happen? How could this happen? And, you know, what's going to happen? And also, you know, raising awareness around the particular mechanisms that stalkers and perpetrators might use today, which is increasingly scary every day, from trackers to
that's right.
phone. We see things like Telstra and other companies. Every day there's some change to their policy to protect people or accidentally exposing people. So I think that maybe the thriller genre has that a bit of an activation space.
Yep.
For that. That's just a thought. And Fiona, you should connect with Ali Telemkos, because she's writing a screenplay around DV set in the 1970s.
Who was that? Sorry, Ali
Telemkos. Did you know Ali from Swinburne? No. Anyway, and she's so in terms of their future research around film, she's very much writing and has had some stuff published around representation of domestic violence and policing in film. And she's looking at work at the moment set in the 70s. So how do you write about a crime before it was a crime?
Yeah, exactly, because the Crimes Act didn't include domestic violence. And interesting too, Carolyn, that whether there's going to be more focus on, we've had a lot more public discussion around coercive control in the last couple of years. And I mean, that was always, in New South Wales anyway, it was always in the Domestic Violence Act, but it's now become a separate crime itself. So whether that actually also becomes more, we see it in a couple, but whether that becomes more common as a theme. I think what would also be interesting, I mean, and this has been quite narrow in the fact that it's been looking at commercially published. What would be really interesting is also to look at that which is, you know, not commercially published, but published sort of like because I'm sure there's going to be, that's where you'll find the First Nations, and that's where you'll find LGBTI, and those, I think that's where you're going to find the marginalised issues about DV. Again, an assumption, but I have a sneaking suspicion.
And maybe in the more hybrid genres that maybe aren't sort of strictly crime fiction, but have an element of that. I mean, Big Little Lies is sort of the hybrid, an example of that maybe. So that would be interesting to, investigate a bit further. But yeah, Carolyn, that's Ali sounds fantastic. That project
I'll connect
sounds really
you
good.
up. And she's also a documentary filmmaker on domestic violence and economic abuse. So
financial crime. It's very, at the moment, they're seeing an increase of it because of, and also elder abuse is an increase in that as well.
I have a question.
Sorry, I missed the first half. Sorry.
Yeah. So first, thank you for your wonderful presentation. So my question is, like, in your presentation, you talk about like almost all the victims are white, upper middle class, and heteronormative, and the erasures of difference attempt to universalize the experience of domestic violence and think about it in a very normative terms for easy consumption. So I was wondering, like, if elaborate on the idea of easy consumption, like how, like why focusing on white upper class and heterosexual women can be considered as easier to consume by reader? Is it about readership or something else?
No, definitely by readership. Ellie, do you want to expand on this? I've got a few ideas, but I've just done lots of talking.
I think that's based on the that comment is based on the sort of treatment of DV in the media, where it's very I'm talking like bad media outlets that sort of use really apologist language to talk about perpetrators, that focus primarily on white victims, caring only about them in a way that suggests that the Australian public only cares about those sorts of stories. So I suppose that, yeah, to say that they are for easy consumption is based on that assumption that we've made about what the Australian public reads and what they expect in their media reports, maybe. It's certainly not true, obviously, at all. Like that's not,
and I think actually if you did, I mean, I've come from working with the police and in New South Wales, and I know that the statistics for domestic violence in First Nations is just, it's off the charts. I've rarely see anything in a newspaper about it.
Thank you. And my second question is that, like, in your research, how do you exactly define commercial publications and non-commercial publications? Is it more based on publishers or how many
publishing
copies?
houses? Yeah, so the big publishing houses.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I will say though that when we did our initial search, we looked everywhere, didn't we, Fiona? Like we looked at self-published. We had, our list was didn't just feature sort of the big five, but that is certainly something that we probably need to expand upon a bit more in the paper, because I remember in my PhD proposal I had this idea of literary fiction as a genre, and someone on my confirmation said, what does that mean? What is that? And I feel like the saying commercial fiction is probably a bit similar. So I think maybe we change our wording about that and sort of say that we've looked at the big publishers, right? Yeah,
I think I kind of see the commercial ones as the ones that are sitting in the DMX or 1 to 10 bestsellers, you know, like that are published in that the larger format, you know, that are sitting there in the shelves on the 1 to 10. That's kind of how I viewed it. But we need to look, and also in the paper we need to define our definitions, our terminology as well, to make it tighter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question. So I guess I also, and maybe this is a massive question, but talking about definitions, I would ask, like, how also do you define crime fiction? And the reason I ask that is because I think that a lot of writers writing in this space are, well, at least what I'm looking at in my research is that I would argue that they're updating certain tropes or to better sort of depict this kind of violence.
Because it evolves, yeah, it evolves.
Yeah, and so perhaps what I'd sort of argue is crime fiction may not be seen as crime fiction by you know, the reading public. It might be more of an interpretative lens that we can say, well, this is how crime fiction is depicting domestic abuse. This is crime fiction, even though it might not be recognizable as such, because it doesn't take all of the tropes, such as you know, detection and resolution, for example. So yeah, so I'd just be interested in, you were talking about before, Ellie, about sort of more hybridized texts, and I guess I'm trying to find a question in my thoughts. I guess I'm interested in, yeah, how do you define crime fiction, and can you define this kind of fiction as a kind of updating or response to traditional crime fiction, maybe not serving this type of story that well?
Yeah, I think, I mean, Carlos, you said before about the predictability of the novels. There are still some of those elements of crime fiction. A crime takes place. It's often, though, not just one crime, it's an ongoing situation. There is often detection involved. There's often like a sort of comeuppance at the end or a conclusion. But it is, they're definitely, though, they're not super prescriptive. They don't follow, they're not all the same. They do different things, they use different devices. So I think, our definition of crime fiction is sort of a bit hybrid. I think actually, Stuart, we've used some of your work in the paper about it being a genre that changes depending on the cultural, political context, that it is a hybrid genre that sort of looks different depending on those contexts. I know that's a very vague answer. I've got it written down somewhere, how we defined crime fiction. Fiona, did you have anything to add about that?
And I think too, when we started out, we had a very traditional definition of crime fiction, like the Henry Sutton definition, where there was basically a crime occurred, there was investigation, a red herring, and then a conclusion. So it was quite traditional, which is why these kind of crimes stood out, I suppose, because it didn't fit that traditional framework, which is what. But like everything, these things evolve because our community and our society evolves. So what was good in 2014, when you were looking at the beginning of this, is different perhaps to the books that are coming out now in 2024. Maybe, that's something also to look at, this kind of evolution of it.
Yeah, and I think they sort of take elements, these ones, of, like we said, of like domestic noir, but then they're different to that because the protagonists aren't sort of unreliable. They're not there's not like a fragmented kind of narrative either. So they take elements of that in terms of theme, but maybe not structure or style. And then, of course, things like The Dry, you've got that sort of bush noir focus, or rural noir. So they sort of take little bits from everywhere, and mainly, or predominantly, from crime fiction genres. But maybe they're creating their own sort of their own style. Maybe the vigilante stuff particularly is a sort of emerging subgenre. I'm not sure. Stuart,
No, don't finish. I have a follow-up question. So
that was basically it.
I was just wondering, I know we're going slightly over time here, but please indulge me. I was wondering if there are any of these stories, or if you know of any stories told from the perspective of the male perpetrator.
No.
No, I'd love to read that, but no, not that we found.
I'd love to see a male victim.
Yeah. Okay.
So one could say that, but not. Yeah, it's nothing from the perpetrator's point of view.
Aside from sorry, Stuart.
No, I was just going to say I've just read a short Catalan crime novella from 1927, which involves a man is in it's a courtroom drama where a man's in the dock for having killed his lover, and he thinks that the prosecutor is an idiot because he's just painted him as a monster, but he also thinks that the defense lawyer is an idiot because he's used what was a defense at the time, a crime of passion, that she had made fun of him and was going to leave him, and so he in this moment of rage killed her. But the tension in this story comes from, it's not a very long one, it's only about 45 pages. The tension in the story comes from at different moments, he's about to interrupt the court case and tell his story as to why he did it. And it turns out that he did it because he's a very passionate person. But this passion led him to push and push and push the woman to constantly reaffirm her love for him, which meant that she actually fell out of love for him, and he recognizes that he is the person responsible for he is the person responsible for her death, from not just because he killed her, but because of the reasons why he killed her. So it wasn't a moment of passion or just a crime of the moment, but it is an interrogation of that sort of Iberian honor codes, masculine honor codes of the time. And I'm quite surprised by this. It's from 1927 or 28. We're not exactly sure which.
That's really unusual for that time too.
Sounds great. Yeah. That sounds great, Stuart. Yeah, I think a lot about the sort of anti-hero kind of stories that we like. I'm thinking of like the show The Fall. I know he's not a domestic abuser specifically, he's a serial killer, but we get those perspectives even like in sort of classic literature. We've got the humbits of fiction. So I'm surprised and interested that we don't see that as much in, well, maybe I'm not surprised in this particular genre because of the focus on the victims and survivors and how they get out. But that would be really interesting. What was that one called again, Stuart? Sorry, the one you read?
It was called, the English title would be The Crime of Pere, P-E-R-E, Darnell, D-A-R-N-E-L-L. It hasn't been translated. I've only found it recently. So
okay. I'm just crossing it out. My Catalan's not that good.
So I'm planning to write about it.
That's great.
But again, it sort of goes back to that the question about Martine's question about the how do we define the genre, because this hasn't been in Catalan crime fiction, in histories of Catalan crime fiction, this has not been considered to be a crime novel because it doesn't follow the history, whereas I'm arguing there's a lot more experimentation going on in the early days before people started following certain patterns. And just very quickly, going back to the question about why, is the genre right to describe this? And Carlos saying, when you get to the end, you've got that moment of satisfaction. I didn't finish Jane Harper's The Mother. It just seemed too predictable, and I left it. And I kind of knew what was going to happen at the end, and then I'd heard about it, so you didn't spoil it for me. I really enjoyed her other book, but yeah, this one I just didn't. And so there's always the risk that people don't read to the end to get that moment of catharsis.
And also, is it really? Oh no, I'm about to answer my own question, but is violence, solving violence by violence, is that really cathartic? That's another question. But anyway, I've gone, my head's gone elsewhere.
We have time for one very short, brief question, which leads to a very brief answer. No. In that case, thank you very much to Fiona and Ellie. And I hope to see everyone in the next seminar, which is a very important seminar because I will be giving it on the 26th of November on communist crime fiction. So thank you, everyone, and I will see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, Carlos. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.